What's up, everybody? So I'm dropping engine building DIY number 2. Again, these are some older videos. The videos are covering talking about rod clearance to the block, how I check rod clearance, the tools I use to grind rod clearance, how I grind it, how I check it. There's, I think, 3 or 4 clips all spliced together. There's a time lapse in there. And then at the very end of the video, there's some pictures of the final result. So you can pause those and kind of look through them. There's actually some pictures of like the marks on the rod that the aluminum filler rod will leave if you do it properly and stuff like that. So I hope you enjoy the video. I hope you learned something from it, and there's more to come. Thank you for tuning in. So what we got going on tonight is I took the block and I vacuumed it, and I took a brush, just a regular old paintbrush, and I just went through knocking all the chips down, vacuuming everything up I could, wiping it down with my lint freeze. You could use blue paper towel. Again, this is before the final wash anyway, so this block's gonna get super washed really good before you gotta worry about paper towel fibers and all that stuff in there. So we're gonna get ready to check the stroker clearance. And what I wanna do in this video is just talk about the stuff that you need, how to lay everything out, how to measure stuff, the lubricants, and I think that's it. So let's just jump into it. So some of the stuff that you're gonna need, you're gonna need 2 main bearings at the minimum, 2 rod bearings, the piston and the wrist pin, the rod itself. I like to use a zip tie, and I'll show you about that in a little bit. I do have my lint free, but again, this could be just a paper towel or, you know, even a microfiber you could get by. I got, for the rod, is a 7/16 12-point socket. Now, I do recommend buying a good quality socket for these rod bolts. The last thing you want to do is strip out a rod bolt or have the socket break or anything like that when you're trying to torque a rod bolt. So get a good quality snap-on. I'm not the kind of guy that says snap on everything. There's plenty of Harbor Freight stuff in my box, believe me. But where it counts, spend the money. I use a piece of 16th filler rod. So it's 0.62 in diameter. And when you're doing stroker clearance, what you're looking for is the rod hitting the block, usually in this area, and then the back of the rod hitting the girdle. Okay? If you're checking girdle clearance and you want to rotate the engine, you'll need 4 main bearings. But I'm going to do it with just the 2, and I'll show you what I'm doing there. I'm not going to rotate the engine over, so I don't need the bearings that go in the girdle. So I use this here. You could grab a piece of coat wire and measure it, or coat hanger wire and measure it. You could use feeler gauges. I find that this works really good for reaching far down into the block. You know, when you got the crankshaft and everything in the block, you can reach down in there and check that clearance real easy. Also, it's aluminum, so it's gonna bend real easy, and you'll be able to form it, hook it, however you need to check it. I got a Sharpie, Milwaukee or Sharpie brand, whatever floats your boat. You need your crankshaft, okay? Then lubricant wise, you're not assembling the engine, right? So you could use any oil you got. You could probably get away with even WD-40. If you're gonna use your engine assembly lube, there is one thing I do want to talk about, and that's your brushes. Now, if anybody's ever bought these brushes before, they don't come with tape on them, and there's a reason for that. So what I do is I go a little bit overboard, and I actually fill the top of this with super glue. So I'll pour super glue down in there and let it wick into this top portion of all these bristles. And what that does is that stops these bristles from coming out. So you'll never have bristles stuck on your bearings or crankshaft or anything that you're trying to lubricate. You glue them in there and you do that. And then what I like to do is I tape the handle, because these are just rolled metal and they'll always catch my hand, or grease will get in there, dirt will get in there. When it's like this, it's a lot easier to clean, but it's a lot of work for something that is a throwaway part too. But one little plastic bristle stuck in a bearing, not good. So if you're using grease, take this second, fix you up a good brush. I've had this same brush for probably 6 years, 7 years probably, maybe even 8, I don't even know. I use the Driven racing oil, BR30, BR40. There's a braking oil. It's got a bunch of extra additives for the engine. It's good stuff. Some WD-40, some brake clean. And then for clearance in the block for the rod, so the grinding portion after we check everything, the same tools that we used the other day. You know, your files, your hand deburrs, your rotary carbide. I do suggest getting a 1/4 inch single cut carbide for this, because on some vehicles you're really taking off a lot of metal. So a single cut carbide 1/8 inch will really help get that metal out of there quickly. Now that's really about it for the tools that we're going to use on this setup. We'll get the crank in there, and I'll probably make a separate video laying everything down in there and then actually marking it, and then maybe even a third video of me doing the grinding and checking. It's really kind of a pain in the butt to do it because there's just a lot of cleaning in between. You're going to grind, clean, check it, hope that you got it right the first time. If not, you'll grind, clean, check it. So from that point on, we're going to get to it. So we got to start out by breaking our rod down. Usually from the manufacturer, these bolts are still torqued, or if they're not torqued, there's usually a dowel in here that takes a little bit of effort to get out. So we'll break that down. We'll break down how we're going to connect the piston and the wrist pin without actually putting the clips in. So we'll go through that whole process, and yeah, join the ride. So we're going to start out with doing the crank connecting rod itself, okay? And what I got here is a rod vise, okay? Now this rod vise, obviously not everybody's gonna have, but if you have one, it's nice. If not, a couple sheets of aluminum and your regular old bench vise will work just fine as well, okay? So what we're looking to do here is just clamp down on this rod. And these nice connecting rod vices, they really just make sure that they hold the rod straight and even. We talked about this a little bit in a previous video, but 7/16 snap-on socket. I highly recommend getting a good 12-point socket for whatever size of connecting rods you have. The reason I recommend it is these take a lot of force, and the last thing you want is the socket to break or to strip out a connecting rod bolt itself. I've never seen that happen, but I've had the sockets themselves break. So we're going to go ahead and break these loose. So these ones were just basically finger tight, which is good. So we'll go ahead and back them all the way off. And then I bring them back in a couple turns. Okay, we'll loosen up from the vise. And then we're going to turn it around, put it back in the vise, just under the parting line. So far in there, but just under the parting line. And we're just going to give it a couple wiggles while we're pulling this direction. So I'm wiggling up and down like this and pushing or pulling this direction here. And then now it's apart. So you can see the dowels inside this connecting rod here. So those, once they're tightened up, those sit in there pretty tight, and it takes a decent amount of effort to get them apart. Well, now that we got them apart, we can go ahead and unthread these the rest of the way. Now, anytime you're unthreading something like this, always do it over the workbench, because the moment you're doing it over the ground, that's the moment you will drop a bolt. Now, there are recommended bearing tang orientations. So the tang where the bearing goes, there's always a recommended exhaust side or intake side, depending on which side your intake's on, the rotation of the engine, stuff like that. There's very few counterclockwise engines, but there are some, especially in the Honda community. So just keep that in mind. So what we're going to want to do now is just slide this connecting rod down in there and slide the wrist pin through. Now normally there would be clips. If we were final assembling, there would be clips in here that hold the wrist pin in place. But for checking stroker clearance, and I just don't want the wrist pin touching the sleeve or the cylinder walls themselves, I just put a zip tie in with just a couple clicks. Just like this. The zip tie is loose, allows the rod to move, and then that just will stop the connecting rod itself from coming out and falling out. And a lot of times you want to flush cut that as well, because that could rub up and down the cylinder. Won't necessarily hurt something, but you just don't want it to do. And then rotate it back up out of the way. Okay. So, at that point, we're going to take our, lint-free. Again, this isn't a final assembly deal, so you could be using some Bounty paper towel or even a microfiber or something, just to make sure you're not making a big mess or using something dirty. And you just want to clean your surfaces, clean the connecting rod itself, because we are going to put a little bit of torque on this to make sure that it's on the crankshaft all the way. What you want to do is you just want to stick that in the bearing tang just underneath the surface. Press it down and then keep pressing until it's flush with the surface on each side. Now I did make a mental note that these rods, the bearing tanks are on the same side. That's how most of them are, but always pay attention. If you're unsure, you might want to mark the cap above and the cap below the parting line so that you know where it's at as well. We will go through and mark and label all these for each cylinder, give them a home right before final assembly. So we're going to do the same thing here. Get our bearing cap, our rod cap, got our bearing, line the tangs up just underneath the parting line, and then push down until they're both flush. Okay, so at that point, I'm just going to kind of leave this stuff as is, and we're going to go ahead and rotate the camera and get onto the block here. All right, looks like you guys got a good view. Alright, so now we're just going to put two main bearings in for this. I'm hoping that there's not a ton of material that I need to take out, and then I don't have to rotate the engine block on the stand. So again, wipe your bearing surf, wipe your bearing itself. We didn't wipe the rod bearings, if you noticed, and that was because they're coated bearings. So I don't want to rub the paper towel or the lint-free or anything on there for that matter. Until just before assembly, and then we'll do it very carefully with a nice clean one. The mains are not coated, so you're not really going to hurt them wiping them. Again, I put it just under the parting line, push it down, and push it till it's level. So now we got two mains in there, and that'll be enough to hold the crankshaft relatively straight. We talked about this the other day in yesterday's video, that you could use some engine oil, you could even use some WD-40. If you notice, these are a little glossy. They probably picked up some WD-40 that rag's soaked in. But just as a precaution, I am going to use a tiny bit of my engine assembly lube just to make sure that this bearing doesn't get scored up with anything we're doing. You never know if there's metal debris, you've been grinding and cutting and you haven't cleaned everything perfectly. So I just give it a real light layer. That way the crank has something to rotate on. Alright, then at that point we're going to pick up the crankshaft. We're going to carefully set it down into place. Sometimes on the flywheel side you got to be careful because you don't got much clearance for your fingers, so you might want to stick a finger in the pilot hole. This one barely gives you enough without the seal in it. Once the seal's in there, obviously it's a little bit different, but as we have it right now, this is good to go. I'm just going to give it a couple rotations. Now there's no thrust bearing in there, so this crank will move a pretty reasonable amount forward and back. So we're not really worried so much on that, because what we'll do is once we're done grinding the clearance and everything, we'll push it all the way forward, make sure that it's got, we're using that 1/16 welding rod, so that's like 62 thou, 0.062. We'll check, make sure it's got clearance all the way forward, and we'll check, make sure it's got clearance all the way back. Okay, so we're going to leave it right there as is. Now, spin the camera back around real quick. We got the piston itself. We need to stick in the bore. We need to stick in the bore from the bottom, and then get some bolts on the rod. So, for this, I'm going to go back to my engine grease and just put a smidge of grease on the bearings themselves. Just a tiny bit. And again, these bearings that we're using for this, we'll clean off. Now, if you happen to have a bunch of motors laying around that use all the same bearings and everything, you got some old ones laying around that are not bad, you know, there's not a bunch of metal or debris in them, they're just decent bearings still, those are what you want to use for something like this. Unfortunately, I don't have K24 rod bearings and F20 main bearings laying around. This stroker kit uses an F24 or a K24 connecting rod at the bottom, basically. So it's a lower connecting rod, size and dimensions, because it's a K24 crank and an F20C block. Alright, so we got a little bit of lubricant on there. We're going to stick our bolts back in the hole. We're just going to have this sitting and waiting, because once we get the rod and the piston up in the bore from the bottom, it's going to be kind of hard to do all that. So you want to be able to just reach it and put it on. And then we're just going to use a little bit of engine oil for the side skirt, the piston itself. So I'm just going to put a thin layer of oil all over this piston. Now, the cylinder walls themselves already have a ton of WD-40 in them, so this is just a little bit more insurance. We'll spin the camera back around, obviously, so you can see me do this. Now again, super important, I'm going to remind you again, your crankshaft is just sitting there. Do not rotate the block. You rotate the block, the crankshaft will fall on the ground. Not a good day. So we're going to just go ahead and check cylinder 1 first. So I'm going to go ahead and leave. You don't want to leave it with the connecting rod all the way straight, because that's further up you have to push. You want to leave it at about 10 o'clock to like 2 o'clock. That's like the ideal spot, being able to get it in position easily. So just carefully, slowly slide it in from underneath. Okay, so right now I'm holding it up against the crankshaft. And when you grab this, you pinch the bolts and the bolts won't fall out. You flip it. And you want to do more than just start the bolts. Don't assume that the bolts are started. Really thread them down good to make sure that when you let go of this piston, it's not going to fall on the ground either. When building an engine, 90% of it is just being careful and protecting your investment. So keep that in mind. So now we're just going to, we're not really going to tighten it. We're just going to basically get those dowel pins to pinch together. why we carry a magnet. One thing I'm not doing that I usually do, constantly clean my hands so that I don't have oil on them. When you have oil on them, you tend to drop things. Being at this stage of an engine build, it's obviously not a terrible thing. If you drop a socket or something down there, you're gonna grab your magnet, pick it up. Alright. When you don't want to drop something is when the oil pan's on it and you drop it from the top end and it falls down in the oil pan. It's not a good day. So definitely be careful. Keep your hands clean and free of oil. If you're using gloves, change them, clean them, do whatever you got to do there. Again, I just got my grip way high. I'm just putting enough force on there to close up that area there. Okay. So what I'm going to do is probably try and get my phone. Probably try and get my phone down in there or something. Actually, I can't even visually see it, so. Well, it's definitely hitting. It's hitting the top rod area right in here. Let me see if I can pop, I can pop this off real quick, I think. Okay, so down in here, where it's hitting on the rod is right in this area here. So as you rotate, you have to look with your eye, and honestly I don't even know if the camera shows it that well. Hope you guys can see it down there. But where it's hitting is right here on the bottom of the bore. So now we're going to try and get a marker down in there and mark it up good. Try and estimate roughly how much is hitting. That way we can get a good idea of what we got to grind out. So once we grind it out though, this is our welding rod, and we'll stick it down in there and make sure that it's got the appropriate amount of clearance. Sometimes the best thing to do is leave the rod on the other side of the block and use it as a center line. And so you're just going to look down in there and use the rod as a center line. Now these are I-beam rods, so realistically we have just a small groove that will cut out, probably no more than 3/8 to a 1/2 inch. And then as you bring it back around, before it goes all the way down, you can kind of check your mark, rotate it back, draw a little more, and check it. Having a flashlight can help in this situation too, but I can see it pretty good. I just know that you guys can't really see it on the camera. Okay, so I got that marked pretty good, and what it looks like is it's gonna be pretty much the same story on both sides. Now again, you got to keep in mind that you got that thrust washer clearance as well this way, because on a race engine, if you smoke a thrust that will push that crankshaft, and while you'll need to rebuild the engine, it won't be nearly as bad as if one of the rods hit the block. A rod hits a block, you're going to be in big trouble. You smoke a thrust bearing and catch it in time, you can easily rebuild the engine. Without having to replace rods and stuff like that usually. So I got marks on both sides. What it looks like is basically just the center, and I'll have to measure it out. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate it to the bottom and then lift the crank enough to get it to clear. So now the rod is all the way down in the bore. I lifted it enough to help clear. And what I'm doing is I'm checking. Let me grab another rod here so I can show you. So at first it's hitting right in this area. So we're only clearancing the block this width here, okay? So this is, roughly 3/8 of an inch, so I'll probably make it a 1/2 inch, a smidge bigger, and then deep enough to give that clearance of 60 to 80 thousandths is what's recommended. Now I lifted it and I put the rod all the way down in the bore. So I made it, I lifted the crank out enough to make it clear this area. So now what I'm checking is this area, does it clear the block itself? Okay. So with that being said, while it's close, what I'm gonna do is put a little bit of a bend in my welding rod, get it down in there, and see where it hits. I'm going to undo the camera again so I can show you guys this. This is the reason why I like aluminum welding rod. Now obviously not everybody has a 1/16 aluminum welding rod, but it's almost worth going to your local welding supply and just begging for a scrap piece. I'm going to grab my phone here so I can see if you guys can see this. Okay, you can see it a little bit. Okay. So the aluminum welding rod leaves a witness mark. So this is where it was starting to touch. And obviously you can see in this area the rod is much wider than it is down here. Okay. It was originally hitting down here in this area, and that's easy to clearance. You can see a little bit of a witness mark from the aluminum and me checking it there. But with it hitting up here, that means it's going to be that close all the way across this rod up here. So now instead of doing that 1/2 inch clearance, I'm going to do a clearance that's as wide as this whole rod. Okay. And then that's going to ensure that we have enough clearance. That's one cylinder. So you're going to want to go through, make these same mark locations in each cylinder. I even recommend at least checking number 1 and number 4. If your casting is very different at the bottom of the bores for each cylinder, you might just want to check all the cylinders. But for this block and the way it looks, I think it's safe to say that I'm going to check this one cylinder. I'm going to make those same exact marks on all 4. I'm going to grind them to what I visually think is enough, and then I'm just going to go from there. So at this point, I'm pretty much done checking rod clearance. I called it stroker clearance a little bit ago, and that's traditionally because if you have a stock stroke, usually you don't have problems. But some 4 cylinders are so tight that even just putting an aftermarket rod in there will have clearance issues. So it's always good to check this if you are unsure at all. If you want to make sure, this is something you should always check. And at the bare minimum, when you're finished rebuilding the engine, check it before you start it. Check it before you turn it over. You want at least 60 thou. A 16 filler rod is 62 thou. 80 thousandths for something high revving, for something that grows a lot. If you're building an aluminum rod motor, you want to go up to about 100 thousandths clearance in some spots, because the aluminum in general moves a little bit more, grows more, it flexes more. So you just have to be vigilant and do your due diligence. Check your rod clearance. Be one less thing you have issues with. I hope you guys learned something from the video, and I'll do a time lapse of me grinding this and getting it all ready. Okay, so at this point I'm going to pull it apart and probably start grinding away. Thank you.